The blast was everything Gracia had hoped for and more. The storage chamber erupted in a pillar of flame that rose hundreds of meters into the air, its light visible across the entire spider city. The concussion knocked everyone on the bridge to their knees, and the heat was intense enough to singe their fur even at this distance. But the real devastation came from what happened next. The burning resin, lighter than air and carried by the explosion's updraft, rained down across a wide area of the spider metropolis. Where it landed on the organic structures, it stuck and burned, creating secondary fires that spread rapidly through the interconnected web of buildings. And some of it landed exactly where Gracia had intended, on the massive nursery chambers that housed the next generation of spiders. The reaction was immediate and gratifying. The systematic hunt for the orc survivors suddenly became much less important as thousands of spider creatures converged on the burning nurseries, forming living chains to pass water-filled sacks up from the lower levels. The air filled with their distress calls, a haunting harmony of frequencies that spoke of genuine panic and grief. "Now!" Gracia shouted, and her pack surged forward across the bridge toward the industrial district. Behind them, the structure they had just evacuated was already catching fire, the flames spreading with terrifying speed through the resinous architecture. The industrial district proved to be a maze of manufacturing facilities where the spiders produced their silk, processed their food, and created the complex organic compounds that formed the basis of their technology. Most of the chambers were automated, tended by smaller, more specialized spider forms that fled at the approach of the armed orcs. But navigating the district proved more challenging than fighting through it. The passages were designed for creatures that could walk on walls and ceilings, creating a three-dimensional labyrinth that was disorienting to ground-bound visitors. More than once, they found themselves in dead ends or chambers with no obvious exits. "There!" Helka called out, pointing to a large opening that led toward the section of the city where they had last seen signs of fighting. "That passage leads the right direction." They were moving through a silk processing facility, past massive vats of chemicals and spinning mechanisms that created threads stronger than steel, when Zethus suddenly stopped and held up a hand for silence. "Listen," he said quietly. Gracia strained her ears and heard it, the sound of combat, but not the chaotic noise of a general battle. This was more organized, more rhythmic. The sound of disciplined warriors holding a defensive position against repeated attacks. "Father," she breathed. "He's still fighting." They picked up their pace, abandoning stealth for speed. The sounds of battle grew louder as they approached, and soon they could see the glow of fires through the transparent walls of the passages they were traversing. The spider city was burning in dozens of places now, the fires spreading faster than the creatures could contain them. Finally, they emerged onto a large platform that gave them a clear view of the Warchief's position. Throgner and his surviving warriors had fortified themselves in what appeared to be some kind of temple or ceremonial center, a massive structure with thick walls and a single, easily defended entrance. The area around it was littered with spider corpses, evidence of the fierce fighting that had been going on for hours. But the orcs were clearly in trouble. Their numbers had been reduced to perhaps 15 or 20 fighters, and they were surrounded by hundreds of spider creatures who attacked in waves, probing for weaknesses in the defensive line. "Can we reach them?" Kroger asked, studying the terrain between their position and the temple. "Not without going through the main body of spiders," Gracia replied. "But maybe we don't need to. Next, what's your range with that bow?" The archer studied the angles and distances. "From here? I could probably hit targets around the temple entrance, but not with much precision." "I'm not looking for precision. I'm looking for distraction." Gracia turned to the rest of her pack. "We're going to create another diversion. Hit them from behind while they're focused on the temple, draw some of them off, and give Father's group a chance to break out. Or we could just join them in the temple," Eurus suggested. "Add our strength to theirs. And then we all die together when they finally overwhelm the defenses," Gracia countered. "No, we need to stay mobile, keep the spiders guessing. Make them fight on multiple fronts." It was a sound tactical decision, but emotionally difficult. Every instinct Gracia had told her to rush to her father's aid, to stand with him against their enemies. But she was a leader as well as a daughter, and she had responsibilities to her own people. Next, I want you to target the largest spiders you can see, the ones that look like they're commanding the others. Zethus, see if you can rig any more explosives from the chemicals in this facility. Everyone else, we're going to hit them hard and fast, then withdraw before they can organize a counterattack. The attack began with Nex's arrows. From their elevated position, he had clear shots at several of the larger spider creatures that were directing the assault on the temple. His first arrow took one of them through what passed for its head, sending it tumbling from its perch on a web bridge. The second and third arrows followed quickly, creating confusion in the spider ranks as their commanders suddenly started dying. At the same time, Zethus triggered his improvised explosive, a much smaller device than the one that had destroyed the storage facility, but placed strategically to collapse a section of bridge that the spiders were using to bring reinforcements forward. The explosion sent a dozen creatures tumbling into the chasm below, and cut off one of their primary approach routes. Then Gracia and the rest of her pack were charging down from their platform, hitting the rear of the spider formation like a thunderbolt. The creatures, focused entirely on the siege of the temple, were caught completely off guard by the attack from behind. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. In the confined spaces between the structures, there was no room for elaborate tactics, just the raw, desperate struggle of close combat. Gracia's blades flashed in the firelight as she carved through chitinous limbs and pierced soft joints between armor plates. Around her, her pack fought with the fury of cornered animals, knowing that this might be their last battle. But the diversion worked. The spider forces around the temple began to turn to face this new threat, dividing their attention and weakening their assault on the Warchief's position. Through the chaos of combat, Gracia could see the temple's defenders taking advantage of the respite, launching their own counterattack and pushing back the creatures that had been pressing against their barricades. "Fall back!" she shouted to her pack as more spiders began converging on their position. "We've done what we came to do!" They withdrew in good order, fighting a running battle through the industrial district while the spiders pursued them. But the creatures were disorganized now, responding to multiple threats and lacking the coordination they had shown earlier. The Orcs' superior training and discipline gave them the edge they needed to stay ahead of their pursuers. As they reached the edge of the industrial district, Gracia looked back toward the temple and saw something that filled her with hope. The Warchief's group was moving, not retreating deeper into the structure, but advancing, pushing out from their defensive position and fighting their way toward a different part of the city. Her father had recognized the opportunity she had created and was making his own move. Throgner had seen the fires blooming across the Spider City and known immediately that his daughter was responsible. Only Gracia would have thought to turn the creature's own architecture against them, and only she would have had the technical knowledge to execute such a plan. The diversionary attack on his besiegers confirmed it. When the spider forces suddenly found themselves under assault from behind, when their command structure began collapsing under precisely targeted arrow fire, he knew that the hunting pack had survived and was fighting to reach him. But rather than waiting for rescue, he chose to take the initiative. The spiders were confused and disorganized, their attention divided between multiple threats and the spreading fires that threatened their city. It was the perfect time for a breakout. "Form up!" he roared to his surviving warriors. "We're moving to higher ground." The target he had chosen was visible through the smoke and flame, a massive central spire that rose from the heart of the spider city like the trunk of some impossibly huge tree. It was clearly important to the creatures, possibly serving as their seat of government or a religious center. More importantly, it offered the kind of elevated, defensible position that Orcs preferred for making a final stand. The charge from the temple was devastating. 20 Orc warriors, led by a war chief whose reputation had been forged in 100 battles, smashed through the disorganized spider lines like a warhammer through glass. Throgner's great axe carved a bloody path through their enemies, while his war chiefs spread out in a wedge formation that maximized their killing efficiency. The spiders, already reeling from the attacks on their nurseries and the chaos created by Gracia's diversionary assault, couldn't mount an effective response to this new threat. They fell back in disorder, their chittering calls taking on a note of genuine panic as they realized that their prey had become hunters. The advance toward the central spire took them through districts of the spider city that Throgner had not seen before. There were residential areas where smaller spiders tended gardens of fungus in carefully controlled environments. Commercial districts where various spider castes exchanged goods and services in markets that resembled three-dimensional spider webs more than anything an orc would recognize as economic activity. And everywhere, the signs of a civilization in distress. The fires were spreading faster than the creatures could contain them, and the carefully maintained environmental systems that kept their organic city functioning were beginning to break down. The air was thick with smoke and chemical fumes from burning structures, and emergency lights blinked in patterns that spoke of automatic systems struggling to cope with cascading failures. "War Chief!" Morgoth called out, pointing ahead to where the base of the central spire was visible through the haze. "Something's happening!" Throgner could see it too, a mass gathering of spider creatures around the base of the great structure. But these weren't warriors or workers. They were different somehow, larger and more ornate, their chitinous shells decorated with complex patterns that suggested high status or specialized function. A council of war, he realized. They're gathering their leaders to coordinate a response. It was an opportunity too good to pass up. If he could disrupt that gathering, scatter or kill the spider leadership, the entire city might collapse into chaos. Without central coordination, the individual colony nodes would be reduced to acting independently, greatly reducing the threat they posed to his people. "Change of plan," he announced to his warriors. "We take that gathering before they can organize their defenses." The attack on the Spider Council was the stuff of legend. 20 orc warriors against what appeared to be several hundred of the creature's elite, in a battle that took place on the platforms and bridges surrounding the base of the central spire. The fighting was three-dimensional, with enemies attacking from above, below, and all sides simultaneously. But the orcs had advantages beyond just their military training. They were fighting for the survival of their entire race, while the spiders were defending abstract concepts like territory and authority. They were desperate, while their enemies were merely determined. And they had the blessing of their ancestors, the accumulated wisdom and skill of 10,000 years of orc civilization flowing through their weapons. Throgner found himself engaged in single combat with what was clearly one of the spider leaders, a creature nearly twice the size of the ordinary warriors, its shell decorated with precious metals and rare gems. It moved with the fluid grace of a dancer and the deadly precision of a master assassin, its forearms weaving patterns of attack that kept him constantly on the defensive. But it had made the mistake of thinking like a spider rather than like an orc. It assumed that its superior speed and reach would allow it to wear him down gradually, landing small wounds that would accumulate over time into a killing blow. It didn't understand that orcs were capable of enduring tremendous damage while remaining combat effective, or that they sometimes used their own injuries as weapons. When the creature's claws raked across his ribs, opening wounds that soaked his armor with green blood, Throgner didn't try to avoid the follow-up attack. Instead, he stepped into it, accepting more damage in order to get inside the creature's guard. His war axe, driven by the full strength of his massive frame, sheared through the spider's torso in a single, devastating blow. Around him, his warriors were achieving similar victories. The spider leadership, for all their individual skill and courage, were not prepared for the sheer ferocity of desperate orcs. One by one, they fell to orc weapons, their ichor staining the platforms and walkways around the central spire. And as their leaders died, the spider city began to come apart. Without central coordination, the various colony nodes started acting independently, each one concerned primarily with its own immediate survival. The firefighting efforts became disorganized and ineffective. Military units stopped cooperating with each other, sometimes even coming into conflict over resources or territory. The great spider civilization, which had seemed so overwhelming when the orcs first arrived, was revealing itself to be more fragile than anyone had realized. It was a society built on intricate cooperation and mutual dependence, and when that cooperation broke down, the entire structure began to collapse. "The spire!" Morgoth shouted over the noise of continuing battle. "If we can take and hold the central structure, we can coordinate our people's escape." Throgner looked up at the great tower rising above them, its organic architecture gleaming in the light of the burning city. It was defensible, certainly, and it commanded a view of the entire spider metropolis. But taking it would mean committing his forces to a siege, and he wasn't sure how many of his people were still alive to rescue. As if summoned by his thoughts, the distinctive horn call of an orc ranger echoed across the chaos. 3 long blasts followed by 2 short ones. The signal for all survivors rallied to my position. He turned toward the sound and saw them, a group of perhaps 30 orcs moving through the ruins of what had been a commercial district, fighting their way toward the central spire. At their head was a familiar figure whose movements he would have recognized anywhere. Gracia, he breathed, and for the first time since arriving on this nightmare world, he allowed himself to hope. The reunion was brief but emotional. As Gracia and her expanded group of survivors reached the base of the central spire, Throgner felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. His daughter was alive, and she had managed to save more of their people than he had dared hope. "Report," he said, clasping her shoulder in the traditional greeting between warriors. 43 survivors from the early transport groups," she replied, her voice hoarse from smoke and shouting. "Most of them wounded, but all capable of fighting. We've also recovered some supplies and weapons from the spider armories. Their cutting tools aren't designed for our hands, but they're sharp enough to kill with." Throgner nodded, doing quick calculations in his head. 63 orcs, perhaps half of them wounded, against a spider city that still numbered in the thousands despite the casualties they had inflicted. Not good odds, but not hopeless either, especially if they could hold a defensible position. "The spire?" he asked. "Zethus says the structure is mostly hollow inside, with a central lift mechanism that the spiders use to reach the upper levels. If we can control the lift, we can hold the entire building with a relatively small force." "And the spiders?" Gracia gestured toward the chaos visible through the smoke and flames. "Disorganized. They're fighting fires, rescuing survivors, and trying to restore some kind of command structure. But they're starting to regroup. I estimate we have maybe an hour before they mount a serious assault on this position." "An hour. Enough time to establish defenses, tend to the wounded, and prepare for what might be their final battle." Throgner looked around at his surviving people, the last remnant of a civilization that had once spanned continents. They were dirty, bloody, and exhausted, but their eyes still held the fire that had carried them through a dozen different battles. "Into the spire," he commanded. "We make our stand there." The interior of the central spire was unlike anything the orcs had ever seen. The walls were lined with what appeared to be living tissue, pulsing with a slow, organic rhythm that suggested some kind of massive circulatory system. Bioluminescent patches provided dim lighting, and the air was thick with humidity and the smell of growing things. The lift mechanism was a marvel of bioengineering, a platform suspended by muscular cables that contracted and expanded in response to some kind of neural signal. Zethus managed to figure out the control system within minutes, his engineer's mind adapting quickly to the alien technology. "It's actually simpler than our mechanical lifts," he reported. "More like giving commands to a trained animal than operating a machine. The entire spire is essentially a single organism, bred and shaped to serve as architecture." They established their defensive positions on the 3rd level of the spire, about 50 meters above the ground. The level was divided into chambers that provided good cover and multiple fallback positions, while the lift shaft gave them control over access to the upper levels. If the spiders wanted to reach them, they would have to come up a single, easily defended route. The wounded were placed in the central chamber, where Helka and the other orcs with medical training could tend to their injuries. The remaining fighters were divided into 3 groups, one to hold the lift area, one to guard the external approaches, and one held in reserve to respond to wherever the attack proved strongest. As they worked, the sounds of the spider city gradually changed. The random chittering and chaos of the immediate aftermath was being replaced by more organized noises, coordinated movement, what sounded like military formations being assembled, and a deep, thrumming call that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously. "They're regrouping faster than I hoped," Gracia observed, looking out through one of the spire's transparent wall sections. "And they're bringing in reinforcements from other parts of the city." Throgner joined her at the observation post. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. The spider forces were indeed reorganizing, and they were being led by creatures he hadn't seen before, larger specimens with more elaborate decorations and what appeared to be specialized combat equipment. Elite troops brought in to deal with the orc threat once and for all. "How many?" he asked. "Several thousand, at least. Maybe more. It's hard to get an accurate count with all the smoke and movement." "Several thousand. Against 63. Even for orcs, those were overwhelming odds." "Father," Gracia said quietly, "there's something else. Zethus has been studying the spire's structure, and he thinks there might be other technology here. The spiders aren't just using this as a government building, it's some kind of communications hub. Those organic systems we're seeing? They're like a biological version of our old signal networks." "Meaning what?" "Meaning this spire is connected to others across their planet. If we could figure out how to use the system—" She paused, considering the implications. "We might be able to contact other spider cities. Maybe even find one that's willing to negotiate instead of just trying to eat us." It was a slim hope, but it was better than none. "Do it," Throgner ordered. "But quietly. I don't want our hosts to know what we're attempting." The next hour passed quickly. While Zethus worked on deciphering the spire's communication systems, the other orcs prepared for the coming assault. Weapons were sharpened, armor was repaired where possible, and the wounded who could fight were given positions where they could contribute without putting too much strain on their injuries. The attack, when it came, was preceded by a sound unlike anything the orcs had ever heard, a harmonic chorus of thousands of spider voices raised in what could only be a war song. It was alien and terrible, but also beautiful in its own way, speaking of a civilization that was ancient and sophisticated despite its hostility. Then the first wave hit the base of the spire. The spiders came from all directions simultaneously, up the external walls, through the main entrance, and even dropping from above on silk lines. They had learned from their earlier encounters with the orcs, and were no longer treating them as simple prey. This was a military operation, conducted with all the skill and resources they could bring to bear. But the orcs were ready for them. The first line of defense was a series of improvised traps that Zethus had rigged around the spire's base, explosive charges made from spider chemicals that brought down sections of the external walls, crushing dozens of attackers and blocking several approach routes. The second line was the orc warriors themselves, positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that turned the spire's entrance into a killing ground. The fighting was brutal but organized. Unlike their earlier battles, this was not a desperate struggle for survival but a carefully planned defense conducted by warriors who knew exactly what they were doing. Every orc was positioned to maximize their effectiveness, every weapon was used to its full potential, and every advantage of terrain and preparation was exploited ruthlessly. But there were just so many spiders. For every one they killed, two more seemed to take its place. The creatures came in waves, each one learning from the failures of the last, adapting their tactics to counter the orcs' defenses. They were beginning to gain ground, slowly but inexorably pushing the defenders back toward the lift shaft. "Second level!" Throgner ordered, and his warriors began a fighting withdrawal up the spire. The lift mechanism was shut down behind them, forcing the spiders to climb the exterior walls if they wanted to continue their assault. The second level held for another 2 hours before the sheer weight of numbers began to tell. The spiders had figured out how to use their web-spinning abilities to create makeshift ladders and bridges, allowing them to bypass the lift shaft and attack from multiple directions. The orc position became untenable, and they were forced to withdraw again. It was on the third level, as they made their final preparations for what would likely be their last stand, that Zethus finally managed to break through the spire's communication system. "I've got something!" he shouted over the noise of the approaching battle. "There are other cities, lots of them, and they're all connected through this network. But there's something else, some kind of override signal, a priority command that takes precedence over everything else." "What kind of command?" "I think I think it's a breeding protocol. Something that shuts down all other activities when reproduction is threatened. If I could trigger it. Do it, Throgner ordered without hesitation. Zethus's hands flew over the organic control interfaces, sending signals out through the biological network that connected the spider cities. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, abruptly, the sounds of the assault on their position began to change. The organized chittering of military commands was being overwhelmed by something else, a deeper, more urgent signal that seemed to come from every spider in the city simultaneously. Through the transparent walls, they could see the attackers suddenly breaking off their assault and streaming away from the spire in all directions. "What did you do?" Gracia asked in amazement. "I sent out a signal that their primary breeding grounds are under massive attack and need immediate protection," Zethus replied with a tired grin. "Every spider in the network just received orders to abandon whatever they're doing and rush to defend the nurseries. It overrides everything else, even the desire for revenge against us." The reprieve was immediate and total. Within minutes, the spire was empty of enemies except for the corpses of those who had fallen in the assault. The spider city fell silent except for the distant sounds of thousands of creatures mobilizing to defend breeding grounds that weren't actually under attack. For the first time since their arrival on this nightmare world, the orcs could rest and tend to their wounds without fear of immediate attack. But as Throgner looked out over the burning spider metropolis, he knew their situation was still desperate. The false alarm would only work for so long. Eventually, the spiders would realize they had been tricked, and then their desire for revenge would be stronger than ever. They had bought themselves time, but time for what? They were still stranded on an alien world, outnumbered by thousands to one, with no way to escape and nowhere to run. Unless... "Show me the communication network," Throgner said to Zethus. "All of it. I want to understand what we're dealing with." The young engineer led him to the central chamber where the spire's communication hub was located. It was a marvel of biological engineering, a living computer made of neural tissue and organic conductors that pulsed with the flow of information. Displays of some translucent substance showed patterns of light that Zethus had learned to interpret as data streams. "Each point of light is a different spider city," he explained, pointing to a three-dimensional map that hovered in the center of the chamber. "The network connects hundreds of them across this planet, and look," he manipulated the display, zooming out to show a much larger structure. "It connects to other planets too. This isn't just a city-spanning network, it's interstellar." Throgner studied the display with growing amazement. The spider civilization was far more extensive than he had imagined. Their web of communication and control stretched across dozens of star systems, linking thousands of worlds in a network that dwarfed anything the orcs had ever achieved. "Can we access other worlds through this system?" he asked. "I think so. The connections are there, and the technology seems to be the same biological teleportation that brought us here in the first place. But what? But I'm not sure I can figure out the targeting system in time. The spiders will realize they've been tricked eventually, and when they do..." Zethus gestured toward the sounds of activity coming from the city below. Through the transparent walls, they could see that the spider forces were already beginning to regroup. The false alarm about the breeding grounds was losing its effectiveness as the creatures discovered that the threat wasn't real. Soon, they would return to the spire with a vengeance that would make their earlier assault look gentle by comparison. "How long do we have?" Throgner asked. "A few hours, maybe less. Then we work fast. Gracia, bring me our best scouts. I want them to study this network and identify potential target worlds. Look for places that might be inhabitable but not heavily defended. If we're going to jump blind into another world, let's at least try to choose one where we might survive." As his daughter gathered the scouting team, Throgner continued to study the network display. The scope of it was staggering. The spiders had built an empire that spanned the galaxy, connected by biological technology that was both sophisticated and alien. Each world showed different patterns of activity, different levels of development and population. But there was something else, something that nagged at his warrior's instincts. The network wasn't just a communication system, it was a control system. Commands flowed down from certain hub worlds to others, creating a hierarchy that suggested some worlds were more important than others. "Zethus," he said slowly, "what happens if we don't just use this system to escape? What if we use it to attack?" The young engineer looked puzzled. "Attack how? We're 60 orcs against a galactic empire." "Not directly. But this network, it's their strength, but it could also be their weakness. If someone could take control of the hub nodes, send false commands throughout the system." Understanding dawned in Zethus's eyes. "You want to turn their own communication system against them. Cause chaos across multiple worlds simultaneously. I want to give them more problems to worry about than just hunting us. If spider cities across the galaxy suddenly receive conflicting orders, if their coordination breaks down on a massive scale, they'd be too busy dealing with internal chaos to mount an organized pursuit." Gracia finished, having overheard the conversation as she returned with the scout team. "It could work, but we need to identify the key control nodes and figure out how to compromise them. And we need to move fast," added Nex, who had been studying the display with the keen eye of a hunter. "Some of these worlds look almost empty, abandoned or lightly populated. If we could reach one of them, we could establish a base of operations," Throgner said, the plan taking shape in his mind. "Somewhere to regroup and plan our next move. But first, we create as much chaos as possible." The next few hours were among the most intense in the history of Orc civilization. Working with alien technology they barely understood, the survivors of Gordhak began to systematically sabotage the Spider Empire's communication network. They sent false breeding alerts to dozens of worlds, causing massive disruptions as Spider forces abandoned their posts to protect non-existent threats. They triggered territorial disputes by sending conflicting territorial claims between neighboring cities. They even managed to activate some kind of automated defense system that began attacking Spider installations on several key worlds. But the masterpiece of their sabotage was Gracia's idea, a modification to the breeding protocol that reversed the normal priority commands. Instead of "protect the nurseries," the signal now meant, "The nurseries are the source of contamination. Destroy them to save the species." The effect was devastating. Across hundreds of worlds, Spider forces began attacking their own breeding facilities, driven by an overwhelming biological imperative that they couldn't resist or override. The network lit up with emergency signals as civilization after civilization descended into self-destructive chaos. "That should keep them busy for a while," Gracia observed with satisfaction as reports of chaos poured in from across the galaxy. "Now we run," Throgner said. "Zethus, have you identified our target?" "Here," the engineer said, highlighting a world near the edge of the network. "It shows minimal population, breathable atmosphere, and what looks like ruins of older spider cities. It might have been abandoned, or it could be some kind of research station. Either way, it's far from the main concentration of their forces." "Perfect. How long to set up the teleportation?" "The system is already configured for interstellar transport. All I need to do is input the targeting coordinates and power up the transmission array." Zethus paused, looking uncertain. "But there's something else. The power requirements for moving 60 people across interstellar distances. We'd be draining the entire Spire's energy reserves. This building would probably shut down completely, leaving the Spiders without their primary communication hub for this world," Throgner realized. "Even better. Do it." The preparation for teleportation was swift but thorough. Every surviving Orc gathered in the transmission chamber, carrying what supplies and equipment they could manage. The wounded were supported by their comrades, and the precious cultural artifacts that Gracia had saved from Gordhak were distributed among the group to ensure their preservation. As Zethus worked to configure the teleportation system, the sounds from outside began to change. The Spiders were returning to the Spire, and they were angry. The harmony of their approach was different now, darker, more dangerous, speaking of a desire for vengeance that went beyond mere hunger. "They're coming," Morgoth reported from his position at one of the observation posts. "Thousands of them, and they're not taking any chances this time. I can see siege equipment, Things designed to crack open fortified positions. How long? Throgner asked Zethus. 2 minutes, maybe 3. The targeting sequence is complex, and if I make a mistake, we'll end up inside a star, I know. Take the time you need. The first impact against the spire came as a vibration through the organic walls, something massive striking the structure at its base. The spiders had brought up heavy equipment, tools designed to tear through their own architecture if necessary. They were committed to this assault in a way they hadn't been before. 1 minute, Zethus announced, sweat beading on his green skin as he worked with the alien controls. Another impact, harder this time. The spire swayed slightly, its organic structure designed to flex rather than break. But there were limits to what even bioengineered architecture could withstand. 30 seconds. Through the walls, they could hear the sounds of the spiders breaching the lower levels. Multiple access points were being opened simultaneously, and the chittering of thousands of voices rose in a harmony of anticipated victory. 10 seconds. The lift shaft echoed with the sounds of ascending enemies. The spiders had figured out how to reactivate the organic elevator system, and they were coming up fast. Now! The teleportation effect was different from what they had experienced when leaving Gordhak. This time, there was a sense of vast distance being crossed, of traveling not just through space but through something deeper and more fundamental. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the Orcs existed in a state between worlds, suspended in a void that was neither here nor there. Then reality reasserted itself, and they were standing on solid ground under an alien sky. The world they had arrived on was ancient and empty. Crumbling spider structures dotted a landscape of red stone and sparse vegetation, their organic architecture slowly being reclaimed by hardy plants that had learned to grow in the ruins. The air was thin but breathable, and the gravity was lighter than either Gordhak or the spider homeworld. But most importantly, they were alone. No spider forces waited for them here, no hostile creatures lurked in the shadows of the ruins. For the first time since the destruction of their homeworld, the Orcs could rest without fear. "It's beautiful," Helka whispered, looking out over the desolate landscape. "Empty but beautiful," Throgner had to agree. After the oppressive humidity and constant threat of the Spider City, this barren world felt like paradise. It would be a difficult place to build a new civilization, but it was theirs. "We'll make it work," he said, looking around at his surviving people. "We'll build something new here, something that honors our ancestors while adapting to our new reality. And someday, when we're strong enough, we'll find other worlds that need liberation from the spiders." Gracia smiled at him, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since Gordhak's destruction. "You're thinking like a conqueror already, father." "I'm thinking like an orc," he corrected. "We don't surrender, we don't give up, and we don't let enemies go unpunished. The spiders wanted to hunt us. Fine. Let them learn what it means to be hunted by orcs." As the alien sun set over their new world, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, the survivors of Gordhak began to plan their future. They had lost their homeworld, lost most of their people, and been thrown into circumstances that would have broken a lesser race. But they were orcs, and orcs endured. They would build a new civilization among these ruins, train new warriors in the old ways, and prepare for the day when they would return to the spider worlds, not as refugees, but as conquerors. The war between orcs and spiders had only just begun. The morning sun cast long shadows across the orc settlement of New Gordhak, built among the ruins of the ancient spider city. What had once been a collection of desperate refugees had grown into a thriving community of nearly 200 souls, orcs who had been born on this world and others who had been rescued from spider captivity during the liberation raids. Warchief Throgner stood on the highest tower of their fortress, looking out over the training grounds where young orcs practiced with weapons that combined traditional orc craftsmanship with captured spider technology. They were preparing for another mission, another strike against the spider empire that had tried to make them prey. "Father!" Gracia called from below. She wore the armor of a raid leader now, her hunting pack expanded into a full military unit that specialized in deep strike operations against heavily defended targets. "The transport is ready." He nodded and began his descent. Today's mission would take them to a spider world where intelligence reports suggested the existence of Orc prisoners, perhaps survivors from their homeworld who had been taken before Gortak's destruction, or refugees from other worlds that had fallen to spider expansion. Either way, they would be rescued. That was what Orcs did now. They freed the enslaved, they liberated the oppressed, and they reminded the galaxy that some species refused to be conquered. As he joined his warriors at the teleportation platform, a hybrid of spider biotechnology and Orc engineering that could transport raiding parties across interstellar distances, Throgner felt the presence of his ancestors watching over them. Gortak was gone, but the spirit of his people lived on. The spiders had made a mistake when they tried to make Orcs into prey. They had awakened something that they couldn't control or contain, the fury of a warrior race that had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The war would continue, spreading across worlds and star systems, until every Orc was free and every spider learned to fear the sound of Orc war cries echoing through their cities. And in the end, when the last spider fortress fell and the last prisoner was freed, the songs would tell of how a civilization died and was reborn, how refugees became liberators, and how the greatest empire in the galaxy learned that some prey fought back. The teleportation platform began to glow with contained energy, reality bending around the assembled warriors as they prepared to bridge the void between worlds. Throgner raised his war axe and let out the ancient battle cry of his people, a sound that had echoed across the battlefields of Gortak and would now carry their defiance to the stars. The last exodus had become the first crusade, and the Orcs were going home, to every world where their people had been taken, to every spider city that had dared to think them weak. The hunt was on, and this time, the Orcs were the predators.